Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Ghoul Guides Association, a show where we come together as ghouls and talk about the weird and wonderful history of the Gothic and pop culture. We are, of course, your Ghoul Guides. I am Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And today we are going to be picking up where we left off last time with the Gothic history, with a K, of chivalry. So at the end of last episode, we had gone from the origins of chivalry and it being literally about men on horses with sticks, about how it became a military code, how it became a really, really important part of medieval society, and how it became its own form of literature and a kind of generic convention with the chivalric romances. And at the end of the last episode, I mentioned a guy by the name of Richard Hurd. And we are going to pick back up in 1763 with Richard Hurd and his letters on romance and chivalry. I don't know if I got that the right way around. I write it the wrong way around every single time. I will never know if it's chivalry and romance or romance and chivalry, but it's by Richard Hurd and it has those words in the title.
And I will say as well, before we jump straight into this episode, if you haven't listened to part 1, go and listen to it because Lauren does an excellent job of explaining the history and how we get up to Hurd and his chivalric romances. And also, if you want more, men on horses, go and watch A Knight's Tale because, everyone deserves a treat.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It is the best film ever. And if you saw the post on Instagram, you'll notice that I included David Bowie's Golden Years on the Instagram post because one of the best scenes in the film is where they dance to that. Anyway, Richard Hurd. Mary, have you ever read Richard Hurd's letters on romance and chivalry?
I have, yeah. Yeah, it's it's a key text if you want to study the early Gothic.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember I thought I discovered it myself in the in the wonders that is Echo, which is 18th century collections online, the database that literally fueled my entire PhD. And I remember turning up to a supervision with it and I was like, oh my God, I found this text and it's by this guy called Richard Hurd. And Angela and Andy were like, Lauren, that is a major text. Everyone knows it. It's like a foundational text in the Gothic. And I was like,
I think I read quite early on like extracts from it. They were probably in like one of those like anthology books with like here's some excerpts and like some key reviews and things. But then when I did my work on Scott, like Walter Scott and Ivanhoe, I read most of it. I don't know, more.
Yeah. And I won't be touching on Walter Scott today just because I'm not going to have enough time to go that far into history. But I think eventually at some point we probably will do something on Scott because we've both done, that's one of the writers where we overlap. And if you are familiar with Walter Scott and you've been thinking, oh yeah, this sounds a lot like it, that is because he drew massive, massive influence, not only from the chivalric romances, but from the early Gothic texts that were inspired by the chivalric romances.
And I will say just a quick plug again, just before we deep dive, that when I read Ivanhoe, I had that that thought where I was like, this is just basically A Knight's Tale. So if you want more stuff to do with men on horses and chivalry, it is quite a long read, but it is quite entertaining. So yeah, recommend that.
It's got Robin Hood in it.
Yeah,
literally,
it does.
Okay, so 1763, Richard Hurd, who has been a prominent commentator in matters of education, religion, politics, theology, he was a bishop eventually, writes this text, as I said last time, called either Letters on Chivalry and Romance or Letters on Romance and Chivalry. I should have checked, and I didn't. Soz. But Google a combination of that and it will come up. You can read it on Google Books if you want to go and read it. It is in manuscript format, so you do have to get around that, but it is an accessible text. And it's written, as you might imagine, in a series of letters from Hurd to a friend and colleague. And it's essentially Hurd saying, hey, we as a post-Renaissance British society have really rejected the Middle Ages. We have dismissed it as bad, we've dismissed it as superstitious, and we are a bit obsessed with neoclassicism. Like, if it's not Tasso, we're not interested. And he kind of questions why we're so obsessed at this point in time with the classic poets and the classic writers. And he kind of says, those aren't British. Whereas these writers, these Gothic writers, were British. Now, he is wrong because a lot of these writers and these stories. You might remember from last time I said chivalry is literally French. It is literally a French word. Le Morte d'Arthur, French title, even though it's a British writer. Like, French influence on chivalric romances cannot be dismissed. But what is happening at this point in time in 1763 is that Britain has just kicked France's ass in the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War, I've talked about it before, was this really the First World War. And Britain, being the colonizing devil that it is, has proven itself to be the superior colonizing devil and took a load of land from France. And during the 7 Years' War, anti-French and Francophobic rhetoric is really, really important. And this prompted a revisionist history. Britain wanted to think of itself as having always been destined to be the great European colonial power. And realistically, it never had been. It had always almost been France, even though Britain had historically claimed quite a few victories over their French neighbours. The French court had always been the one to look to. We talked about this right back in the first episode of the Ghoul Guides Association when I talked about the French Revolution. France was top shit. You wanted to dress like the French, talk like the French, eat like the French, act like the French. And after the 7 Years' War, it was like, ew, maybe we don't want to be French. So Hurd, kind of in Letters on Romance and Chivalry, makes this association between the chivalric romances and what he calls Gothic with a K on the end. And he's using Gothic in the sense of a word referring to the Middle Ages and to the medieval. So he's calling them Gothic romances. But he's also intentionally using the word Gothic because it then relates it to the Germanic, taking it even further back to the Germanic tribespeople who were essentially responsible for the fall of Rome. And if you don't know why that is Gothic, go and listen to the first episode of Law Dump. We are doing more of those. They're underway. Mary's just recorded one where I explained the history of the term Gothic. So Hurd basically is like, instead of being Frenchified, let's go back to our Germanic roots, because there's this idea that Britons somehow come from Germanic origins. I'm not an anthropologist and my history doesn't go that far back. I know it's kind of real. But in the early 1760s, they doubled down on this idea that Britons have not a French influence, but an older Germanic influence. And this creates this idea that then somehow there is this older lineage of military superiority and a new type of chivalry that somehow is separate from French chivalry. And it creates a narrative that the Gothic, or the idea of the Gothic and the chivalry that is part of the Gothic, is somehow a native British form. And if we embrace it, then we can recreate the idea of the Briton as an ancient, glorious hero who has for generations been this way, and then therefore is the rightful superior power in Europe.
Yeah, and I think like this is such a British thing to do, to be kind of like, I'm just going to go back and, you know, reconstruct our national identity, and we're going to steal bits and pieces from like a vast tapestry of different cultures. St. George, oh yeah, British, you know, he's a Middle Eastern man who allegedly killed a dragon, but no, he's also the British saint because we just stole that. And also, I mean, even in terms of our language, like our language is ridiculous. How many words do we have in our language that are, you know, they have romantic roots from Latin and French and stuff, but then we also have Germanic roots. But then there's also other ones that come from other places, because we're just like, we'll have a bit of that and we'll have a bit of that. We'll have all the things that we think will make ourselves look good. And I mean, we'll leave it up to you guys to think whether it works.
Well, this is part of they're trying to revise Britain's history into being this homogenous form, because pre-1066 Britain gets invaded a lot. There have been lots of different liege lords of Britain. You have lots of different invading forces, lots of different ruling dynasties of different languages. And as Britain wants to build its identity as a dominating, strong, but also justified and vindicated Christian empire, it needs to rebrand its history. And this is where a lot of the really problematic stuff around the idea of the Anglo-Saxon comes from, because there was no homogenous identity. There was no singular British identity, to the point that really there was no Anglo-Saxon society. There were the Angles, there were the Saxons, there were also the Danes, there were also the Scots, there were also the Celts, there were also the Welsh. And over time, it becomes a melting pot. But that doesn't work, because post-Act of Union, Britain needs to present itself as Great Britain, a conquering, unified, unique nation who has its origins in this glorious chivalric history. And that's essentially what Letters sets up in 1763. So that's where we are. Chivalry now has become such a central part of British national identity. So the year after 1763 was, funnily enough, 1764. And do you know what happened in 1764, Mary?
Quite a quiet year, I think, on the you know, on the Gothic front. No, of course I do. You know, it's a publication of The Castle of Otranto by our good friend Horace Walpole.
Yes, or Dearest Horry, as his correspondents called him, which always makes me
love
giggle.
that. Yeah, right? I love that. Cute.
So, like, yeah, in 1764, Horace Walpole's cousin, Henry Seymour Conway, who is my historical boyfriend, he like had a big load of drama and he was like dismissed from his regiment. And they're sending these really serious letters back and forth about like his dismissal and the king, and it just makes me pissed, where he's like, dearest Horry.
I think, yeah, sometimes like when you read like old names and you're reading like old correspondence, you're like, this is like a nice like term of endearment, but also it sounds kind of silly, but it's not it's not meant to be.
Exactly. So yeah, so Horry Walpole, a good pal, in 1764, right at the end of 1764 actually, publishes The Castle of Otranto. And the first time he famously publishes it as a translation of an ancient Italian manuscript, which really sets up, as we've talked about before, the Gothic's found manuscript trope. But what I really want to talk about is the second edition. Because in the second edition, Walpole not only takes ownership, he also he calls it a Gothic story, because he's now not pretending that it's true. He's acknowledging it as a novel or a novella, and he literally says this is a Gothic story. And this is like the first time that has been ascribed intentionally to a piece of literature, because remember, Hurd's ascribing it retroactively. His Gothic romances with a K are chivalric romances. They didn't think of themselves as Gothic romances.
Yeah. He's also not writing his own story. He's talking about other stuff that's been written. Whereas Horace Walpole has written this whole narrative, and then his first preface kind of sets up that conceit that it was written, it's a translation, and it's been found. So you've got Anufio Miralto, who was a monk who originally wrote it, and it's been translated by William Marshall. But the second preface is where Horace Walpole says, by the way, it was me, everyone's favorite son of the Prime Minister, who's an MP himself. Look what I've done. And all of that first preface was also actually part of the story. But this, what I'm telling you now, is what actually happened.
Yeah, he's like, it's me, everyone's favorite rapscallion of the House of Commons.
Yeah.
And actually, I kind of mentioned this last time, but William Marshall, the name that he chooses for his translator, pseudonym, is a chivalric allusion, because one of the most famous, I think, 13th century knights, the guy who kind of unofficially wrote the book of British chivalry in terms of like his service and his knighthood, was called William Marshall. So it's quite an intentional name, and he sets the novel between the First and the Second Crusades. So it's a very intentionally chivalric text, because he writes it like a chivalric romance. So it has that, and obviously he's pretending it was written around, the 13th or 14th centuries from a much earlier story. So it makes sense, but it's also very intentionally, this is a Gothic text, a Gothic piece of literature, and it is therefore also chivalric, because what Hurd's done is make everything that is Gothic part of this literary tradition that he's identifying and that he kind of reclaims in letters. But what also happens in that second preface is Walpole has this mini tirade against Voltaire. And I just have to preface this because, Mary, you know this too. Horace Walpole, as you might have picked up, dearest listener, from the way we've just been talking about him, really difficult to know when the motherfucker is being serious and when he's joking.
He's just so camp. And what I mean by that is that it's almost like he's always performing. And he likes that. He built a kind of Gothic villa in Twickenham, and then he wrote his own kind of tour guide for it and would give people tours of his own house. Like, he loved to put on a show. He loved for people to come out and hang with him and party with him, but also he wanted to be like, look at all my cool stuff that I've amassed in my house, and also look at my house that I've built and designed myself. So he's very much kind of for the performance. And I think you can definitely see the whole first and second preface as part of that. But then what it means is that when you're trying to, find the serious person, it's like, well, but how much of the second preface is you also maybe rewriting what you've done, or assigning meaning after the fact, or making a performance, and how serious can we actually take you? So it's quite difficult.
Exactly, because if you want to know more about this, you can find out in my forthcoming publication, The Gothic Bit More. But basically, Walpole writes this story at the end of 1764, a year where his beloved cousin and best friend, Henry Silmer Conway, has been unfairly dismissed from his regiment. Walpole writes this massive public defense of Conway. He rails against the injustice. And then he writes a book that's literally about the terrible things that happen when you deny somebody their rightful place, and about chivalry, and about being a good knight and soldier. And like, there's definitely a serious undertone, because in a lot of ways it's a reaction to a very serious thing that's happening. But he is not a particularly serious person in a lot of respects. And in this second preface, he basically is like, Voltaire ain't shit. He wishes he was Shakespeare. How dare he come for Shakespeare? Like, Voltaire is so full of it. Voltaire thinks he's so smart just because he's French. Like, the French can kiss my ass. British chivalry forever. Woo! Which, knowing what we know, that Walpole didn't necessarily have massive love, respect, or regard for the British government, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's like a big patriotic statement. But whether he meant it or not, it definitely inspires readers and onlookers to take the Gothic novel as part of this revisionist history in which Britain has always been a superior, noble, chivalric nation. And it just feeds into what Hurd was doing the year before in making the Gothic a native British literary form, for better or for worse.
Yeah, and it's twofold, isn't it? So it's kind of like, look, here's this like literary tradition that we can now write in and contribute to and maybe like bring back those kinds of older chivalric romances, and it can be very much an English and a British tradition. But it's also like the second part of that is in these stories we can rewrite history and paint Britain as this amazing power and defender and, you know, chivalric hero.
Exactly. Yeah. Because Britain's already colonized its closest neighbors. We are Great Britain at this point, the Act of Union in 1707. And there's this real conscious effort to homogenize Great Britain and to homogenize its history. So you get like, oh, okay, well, Scotland is lesser than England, but Scotland's good points are now British. And Wales's good points are now British. And we want you to fight for our cause. So when we're sending you to war, you're British.
It's so funny, isn't it? Because in a way, English people are still doing this. And
this is what happens every year with football.
Well, I was thinking of the tennis, and what is it, Tim Henman? Tim Henman, who is Scottish.
Andy Murray.
Andy Murray, that's it. So I don't do
Tim Henman is such an English name.
I don't know. But anyway, the really famous one that did really well, and you know, when he wins, he's British, but when he loses, he's Scottish. And that is the point that I'm trying to make, in that English people continue to be selective in the history that they take on board.
Yeah, basically. So essentially what happens is the Gothic novel, by intention or otherwise, becomes this new literary form by which a new identity it becomes a palimpsest. They literally can rewrite their own identity over these existing stories, over these existing tropes, over these existing ideologies. They can separate chivalry from its French origins. They can separate these ideas from their European origins, and they can make them British. So just in terms of our contextual moment, in the 1760s and 1770s, two really important things are happening. And one of them is the cult of sensibility. Mary, do you know why I call it a cult? It's not just me, by the way. I haven't made that up. I wish I'd made it up, but I can't take credit for calling it a cult.
Oh, gosh, you know, tell me why. Because now that you've said why is it a cult, I'm just imagining like all of these people surrounding like all of these like authors being like, you know, we worship you and, you know, tell us how. I guess that's part of it, isn't it? Because of all the manuals of how to act. Yeah. I panicked and was like, I don't know this. And then was like, yes, I do.
Yes, I do. You literally were like, I don't know. Here's the answer. Yeah. So we call it the cult of sensibility because sensibility was a trend in, I'm going to call it a cultural trend because it's behavioral, it's socio-political, it's art. But sensibility was basically born out of the Enlightenment, and it was a precursor to Romanticism. And it very much was about feeling and about being in touch with one's feelings, embracing one's feelings. It was about softness and politeness. And it was kind of, again, it's not purely a British form, but in the British sense, sensibility was all about this new society of a growing middle class and a growing global British empire, that this was the rule. Sensibility was the way that you formed your politeness, you formed your conversation. So sensibility was about being in touch with one's feelings. One of my favorite ways to say that I don't like something is to say that it offends my sensibilities, because that's literally to be sensitive, to be sensible to something is to feel a certain way about it. But it was a cult because people literally were obsessed by it. And some people took it really fucking far. So like the dandy, the very over the top, effeminate form of masculinity was attributed to the cult of sensibility, the faints and swoons of sickly, women. I mean, fucking Edmund Burke, we talked about him last time, but he's to blame for this too. He said that women couldn't be beautiful if they weren't a little bit sickly. So everybody was like, oh, I'll just make myself look like I've got a touch of TB to get myself a husband.
And it was everywhere. It was everywhere. Like, there were magazine articles, there were entire, like, conduct manuals, and even in, like, literature, which was, growing, like, the novel form was kind of still emerging at this point, but everywhere it was kind of like, this is how you dress, like what you read, how you act, how you respond in social situations is what you should do, what you shouldn't do, and all of it is about connecting to your feelings in the right way and showing that to society. It was everywhere.
Yeah, and that's why we say it's like a precursor to romanticism, because part of sensibility was, for example, being able to look at somebody poor and impoverished and feel sympathetic towards them and be moved by them. It was to be able to look at a scene of natural splendor and to actually have a feeling about it. It was basically just having fucking feelings, but some people took it real extreme. It did produce very over-the-top, excessive fashions. And some people were like, oh, this is bad. Like, our men are becoming very effeminate, doesn't leave much space for women. So our women are becoming, like, useless because they have to be so hyper-feminine to be feminine because men have encroached into this feminine space. And there is some kind of gender binary stuff there that some writers have unpacked quite eloquently, like Declan Kavanagh. Had a moment there when I was like, is it Declan or Duncan? But Declan Kavanagh. But essentially the cult of sensibility is this big boom moment. And you do get critiques of it, like Henry Mackenzie's Man of Feeling. Wollstonecraft kind of critiques it. But people by the 1770s, even though it's like, well, we need sensibility because we can't be rough, we can't be barbaric, we're not that type of Gothic, we're the chivalric kind of Gothic, but we need to be a good empire. And in 1775, not only is my girl Jane Austen born, the American bad boys across the sea, or the ocean, declare their independence. So the Declaration of Independence by the future founding fathers and the Sons of the Patriots Rebellion causes a lot of issues in Britain because pretty early on, it becomes quite clear that it's not a battle that they're going to win.
It's also quite rude. It's quite rude. We've just gone over and colonized this land, and now they've turned back and been like, actually, no, thank you. I think we're going to go this on our own and carry on. Yeah, your colonization project, but also just without you.
Yeah, it's like we've decided that we're going to colonize on our own now, because it's not like it's the colonized wanting to stop being colonized. It's the colonizers being like, wait,
this isn't the indigenous people being like, by the way, can you stop colonizing us?
Fuck off.
But it's the people that have gone over there and are like, actually,
yeah, like George Washington
do something different
in the 7 Years' War. That's why he was a general. But anyway, so the American Revolution happens, and famously, Britain did not win.
Hey, no spoilers. I haven't got to that part in my history book.
Fuck. The tea went in the river and people fell out. Anyway, so Britain loses its biggest colony to essentially its own people. And this is where this has a lot of issues.
The other thing that I find really funny about that is, guess who France backed in this war?
Yeah, if you've seen the Hamilton, the reason the Marquis de Lafayette backs the French is because the French were so salty after the 7 Years' War that they were like, oh, your colonies are rebelling. Great for us. Fuck you, Britain. Anyway, so this caused a massive national and moral panic. Even Richard Hurd, who I mentioned earlier from Letters on Romance and Chivalry, he was like, this happened because our young men are effeminate pieces of shit, essentially, which problematic in loads of ways. But he essentially critiques the education of young men. He's like, we send our young men on the grand tour, they go to Europe, they become foppish, they become silly, they aren't serious. That's why we lost the war. And this is backed up by a lot of other people. Some of you who are familiar with Pride and Prejudice might know the name Fordyce of Fordyce's sermons. Fordyce famously was a puritanical piece of shit who hated women and basically everybody else. The text that Austen refers to, which you know that he's not a good dude because it's Mr. Collins' favorite fucking book, but the text in Pride and Prejudice is sermons to young women. And I always was like, you misogynist piece of shit, but he hated young men too. There's also a sermons to young men. And in sermons to young men, he basically says, you all need to man the fuck up. You've lost the national virtue. These are not British men. These are not Englishmen. Where are our ancient glories? So people like Fordyce and Hurd are basically saying, like, sensibility has gone too far. Like, it's made us weak, it's made us foppish, it's made us unable to defend our empire. So, Mary, what do you think they propose as the way to fix that?
War?
I mean, yeah, basically. But the thing is, like, what they're anxious about is the fact that they're going to lose another war. France is
what this is actually really reminding me of is our current moment where so many people are saying, you know, men are so woke, they're too emotional, you know, they're too effeminate. And I mean, just recently there was that kind of alpha boot camp that was set up in America where it's just a load of men like screaming at each other and like going through all these like pseudo army drills. And so many like there's so many both like in Britain and America, and I'm sure elsewhere as well, where you have these kind of like fake armies that have been set up where they just like cosplay as like soldiers and stuff. And it's exactly that. It's a reaction. It's exactly what you're saying now. It's like a reaction to this kind of more
history repeats itself every single time. Like every time we have a period of liberation, we will undoubtedly have a period of conservatism. And that is what happened in the 1770s. In the 1760s, it's like, oh my God, we want all this stuff. We are going to be the new, like, we're going to be the new, like, heart of Europe. And, you know, obviously the French court was extremely excessive, and it was fashionable, and it was, you know, women held salons, and it was all about, like, you softened yourself through conversations with women. And all of a sudden, Britain, England, is like, oh shit, we lost the war. We lost our major colony. We no longer not only don't have this land, we don't have their taxes. France backed them. Like, what the fuck are we going to do? And funnily enough, chivalry essentially is the answer, because sensibility and chivalry are kind of two sides of the same coin. They have the same values at their heart. The difference with sensibility is sensibility is not militarized. Sensibility is domestic. Intentionally so. Sensibility is intentionally a domestic rhetoric. You know, a lot of these sentimental novels would be the hero sees a sex worker like when he's in London, and he talks to her, and, you know, she's got a child, and he gives her some money, and he takes the child and places it in a school, and, you know, he spends all day in bed crying. And it's that kind of thing where it's like, yeah, it is excessive, but it was kind of, you know, this moment of maybe we should be more in touch with that empathy for other people. Which, fair enough, like the idea of the self is quite new in 1770. But essentially, Hurd, Fordyce, the government, they're like, is gone too far. But they can't go back because you got to be polite. A British gentleman has to be polite. He's got to turn up at court. He needs to know how to dance a quadrille. He needs to speak French. He needs to be educated. How do you have a man who is sentimental and soft. So he's not rough, he's not violent, he's not aggressive, but he can still win a war. Chivalry, basically. So chivalry starts to become more and more and more popular. The neoclassical ideal starts being replaced by this chivalric Gothic ideal. And this is where we get something like Clara Reeves, the Old English Baron, which has a soldier who returns from war, who is, you know, a godly soldier. He's very chivalric. He's very in touch with his feelings, but that man's going to win a duel. You know, he's going to win the fight. And basically, chivalry gets rebranded again. And the British gentleman becomes inherently militarized. Now, this is partially because if you were the second or third son, you're probably going to be a soldier of a rich family. Like, let's be honest. And it's the continuation of the knight thing that we talked about last time. In the same way that if you had a horse, you would probably landed gentry. The leaders of the British Army, because you had to pay your way in, they're all the sons of aristocratic and noble families. Now, there is some upward movement. If you're a middle-class family who's on the up and up, you can pay for your son to get into the military. He could end up a general. He could be shaking hands with people that are descended from royalty. It's absolutely possible. But what's important is, if we go to war again, are we going to be able to defend ourselves? And more importantly, are we going to be able to win? So the sentimental gentleman becomes we get another rebrand, and chivalry becomes the hot topic, and we get the militarization of the British gentleman. Which, Mary, do you know how that happened in terms of fashion?
Oh, I'm looking forward to you telling me why. I mean, all I've been thinking about with your lovely description there is just, you know, it's basically like, okay, the sensibility, like, gentleman, good, but needs some work. So in order to fix this, you know, get that man a horse and a stick and a sword.
Yeah, basically.
So I don't know. Does fashion reflect that?
Yeah, kind of. So if you're familiar with 18th century fashion, which if you've watched a period drama, you probably are, you might know that the Georgian fashion is very flamboyant because it's inspired by the Sun King and the French court. Lots of brocade, lots of embroidery, lots of silks and satins. Men wore heeled shoes. Everybody wore wigs, big hair. That's courtly dress, so they didn't dress like that all the time. But generally, fashion is very soft and elegant for both men and for women. Obviously, women wear the big, huge, I can't actually remember what those dresses are called, but the huge Georgian side hoops, which is very different to the Victorian round hoop. It's like just your hips are fucking huge and you have to go through the door sideways. So basically, in the 1780s and 1790s, a couple of things happen. Obviously, you have the French Revolution and the Revolutionary Wars. And obviously that means that trade slows down. You also have the hair powder tax, which means that, so the reason that everybody has white hair in the Georgian era is because everyone's powdering their wigs. And they start taxing that. And that means that obviously people can't get hold of it. So all of a sudden, this neoclassical, short, dark, curled hairstyle becomes really fashionable for men. And the soldiers' uniforms change. They're not practical, they're effeminate. Everybody's looking to the hussars, which are these Prussian soldiers who wear these super, super tight, kind of calico-covered breeches that leave very little to the imagination. And these tight, short-cut jackets with the big hats and the emboss. It's designed to amplify the male form. And Britain's like, that's a good look. That makes the soldier attractive. So they change the British soldiers' uniforms. What then happens is that becomes fashion. So all of a sudden you get that classic Mr. Darcy look. You get the fitted breeches, the long riding boots, the short jacket. the military fashion becomes the masculine fashion. So even in the domestic, we have this very militarized men's fashion. So even a man like Mr. Darcy, who's not a soldier, he's not going to war, he looks like a soldier. He looks like a man who would defend you. And of course, then he looks like a hero. He looks like a chivalric hero. He has that strong masculine physique, and people were like, you know, padding their thighs and their shoulders to look more manly in these costumes. But literally we get in the domestic space chivalry as the preferred British form of masculinity. So why am I talking about this? Because I want to introduce two gals, both called Mary. As you know, my dear friend, my favourite people are called Mary.
Terrible name. Honestly, could not recommend it. That's an aside for another day.
No. Do you have an idea of which two Marys I might be talking about?
Do you know what? No, because there's so many stupid Marys in just everywhere. Like,
I'll give you a clue. They're mother and daughter.
Okay. Are they royalty? No.
They're writers.
We're talking Wollstonecraft and Shelley, right? Yeah,
we are indeed talking about Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, her daughter.
We'll allow it. We'll allow them the name.
They can be Mary, it's fine. Okay, so yeah, I want to talk about Mary Wollstonecraft and her daughter, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, famously the two women who wrote Vindications of the Rights of Women and Frankenstein. So when we talked about Edmund Burke back in the first episode, God forbid I'm bringing them up again, I mentioned that one of the people who was very much not impressed with Burke's over-the-top response to the death of Marie Antoinette and the French Revolution was Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft writes essentially a text that is a response to Burke via Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine writes Vindication of the Rights of Man in response to Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution, and then Mary Wollstonecraft writes Vindications of the Rights of Women, which she's kind of on Paine's side, so she kind of like is like, hey, I agree with you, but where the fuck are the women? So she writes this
excellent point, by the way. Yeah.
Now, Wollstonecraft, God love her, has some problematic ideas about masculinity. I will say that up top. You cut the woman some slack. This is the 1780s. But that being said, her ideas about masculinity are quite restrictive and reductive. She is not chill with what she calls equivocal beings. She has a very stern approach to men who she sees as being effeminate. So I just want to put that out there because her rejection of sentimentality and sensibility in this way is not the same as potentially later writers, even her daughter.
And I think, yeah, we definitely do need to cut her some slack because at this point, feminism wasn't really a thing. And that's why she's considered, one of the proto-feminists, the founding women that kind of starts, well, she doesn't start the movement, but she very much inspires it. And we probably wouldn't have feminism both in the movement and kind of in theory and stuff if it wasn't for her text. Yeah. With that said, we can also unpack the stuff that we don't agree with, but she's working with like a more or less blank canvas.
Yeah. And essentially what Wollstonecraft says in Vindications, amongst other things, is that men have become unmanly. And in becoming unmanly, they've left even less space for women. And she critiques this idea of women as being hysterical, women as being less capable, women as being less intelligent, and she pushes back against it. And one of the things that she says specifically is that women are like this because you forced women to be this way, because women's education does not give them the ability to be stateswomen, to be, in politics and things like that. She basically says, like, education has made women flippant and silly. And she kind of blames that on the course of sensibility to a certain extent. But what she also does is she brings into question the soldier's education. And I'm not going to go into this too much. I do go into this in my academic work. But essentially, Wollstonecraft says the way that we educate soldiers is bad because what we do is we force them to not think. They follow their king blindly. They're taught to be polite and dance at parties, and it's made them silly and frivolous, and it's made them stupid in the same way that women's education has made them stupid. So she critiques this model that has become quite popular for male education, but she doesn't necessarily critique the manliness of chivalry, because chivalry is all about manliness, let's be honest. And really, chivalry is kind of about like, yes, you do listen to the king, but if you think someone's wrong, you shouldn't follow them blindly. And she kind of says that's what's happened with soldiers. So you could argue she's saying it's not chivalric enough. You could argue that it's a fallacy. You know, it's kind of unclear with Wollstonecraft, I think. But she starts this idea that the soldier's education is actually faulty and that we have a faulty masculinity and that faulty masculinity makes things worse for women. Does that make sense?
100%. Because, like, you know, this happens again and again while men are off, like, you know, ruling society and having conversations about like how the best way to be a man is, and this way is the best way. We need to be more violent, less violent, more emotional. You know, we need more feathers in our hat. We need, you know, all this kind of stuff. Women are just kind of, you know, left in the margins.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think
absolutely.
It always has an impact.
Absolutely. So by this point, Wollstonecraft is writing in the early 1780s, late 1780s. Sorry, I'm getting my dates mixed up there. In response to Burke and in response to the escalation. So 1793 is when the execution happens. I think I said that last time. So I think she's kind of writing against him. And then I think vindication is the same year. I think it's 1793, but don't quote me on that. I did not check the dates. I don't know why. I thought I'd just have them off the top of my head. But what we've had just before Wollstonecraft is this growing trend of the Gothic novel. And it is, as we've said a couple of times, exemplified by the early Radcliffe. So in Radcliffe's early novels, particularly in A Sicilian Romance and in The Romance of the Forest, which are all published before the execution of the French monarchy, you have this hero who is a soldier. He's manly, he's strong, he's brave, but he's also sentimental. He plays music, he cares for his family, he cares for his sisters, he is noble, he thinks for himself, but he's a good soldier. In both of those novels, you have these young men, these militaristic young men who exemplify chivalry. Now, even though Radcliffe's setting these novels respectively in Italy and France, these characters are seen as not being French or Italian. And you might have heard us discuss the idea of the honorary Protestant a couple of times. Mary, can you give like a quick explanation of the honorary Protestant? I think you can probably do it more justice than I can.
It's actually one that I don't necessarily always agree with.
Well, yeah.
But it's basically you have these novels that are set not just in Europe, but in Catholic Europe, which means that there's not going to be any Protestants. Everyone's going to be Catholic. But you have these characters, and they're often the heroes and the heroines who some people read as embodying Protestant ethics and morals, and some people read that these characters as different from the rest of the Catholic characters, and you know it's tying those morals and ethics to a British Protestantism, and yeah.
Thank you. I asked you because I know that you like also have issues with it, and I feel like you have a little bit more understanding of why it's slightly problematic than I do, because I look at it purely from a nationalist perspective. So
it's problematic exactly for that same reason as nationalisms, and that it's reading it in a kind of reconstructive way, in that, you know, why can't these just be characters in a novel? And if you're going to argue that the bad characters are bad because of their Catholicism, why are you then saying that the good characters are good in spite of their Catholicism? And I think I think sometimes it does work in some texts, but it's not necessarily something that I ascribe to. But when you're thinking about like the constructions of nations and Britishness in that way, where you are trying to, you know, rewrite history, then it does fit. It's all about taking the good things and making them fit into what you want to portray.
Yeah, and in this early Gothic, this pre-1793 Gothic, I would argue that there's a lot more of a clear nationalist British Protestant propaganda element to them. The heroes and heroines are meant to represent, I think, these values of Britain as they are preparing for potential war to specifically separate themselves from their French neighbours and from the revolutionaries. So in these early novels, we're getting this kind of like reimagining of the chivalric hero. Literally, because a lot of these novels are set between the 12th and 15th century. So in a lot of ways, these are the heroes of the chivalric romances, because they are imagining them in these time periods. Of course, they're very anachronistic in a lot of spaces, but it's a very intentional allusion. This is an Arthurian knight. This is the hero of, you know, the chivalric romance. Yes, he's not slaying a dragon. He's fending off an evil marquis, but it's the same idea. So chivalry, again, is being used as this British, homogenous, masculine identity. And Wollstonecraft starts to rock that boat. She starts to rock that boat. Vindications rocks that boat. I know I said it was late 1780s earlier. I'm sorry about that. But in the early 1790s, things take a change. 1792, I think, is Romance of the Forest. 1794, when Radcliffe publishes Mysteries of Udolpho, that clear-cut chivalric hero is gone. Valancourt is a wet blanket, for one thing, but he's also a very complicated, problematic character. The masculine martial character is the villain. And the problem is that he lacks chivalry. He could be a hero, but he's not. And we start to get this problematization of the connection between chivalry and violence, and chivalry and the military. And of course, you cannot separate chivalry from its military origins. It is literally a military code of conduct. Radcliffe starts to pick that apart in 1794. And as the Revolutionary Wars goes on, and as Napoleon takes over, and we have this idea of the betrayal of the revolution, those in Britain who were pro-revolution feel like, you know, this is the death of the revolution. He is the great betrayer. And it shifts the way that Britain thinks about the revolution, because those who were pro now become anti, because you essentially have a dictator. He declares himself emperor. It's the very opposite of what the revolution was trying to do. And by 1816, 1817, you have this real disillusionment. You've had years of aggressive British military propaganda. The British soldier, and increasingly the British naval officer, is the pinnacle of masculinity and chivalry. But Europe has been absolutely decimated by war. Absolutely destroyed. And as Europe opens back up after the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, and people start to travel, they see this firsthand. And one of those people is Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. She, in her late teens, after she's eloped with Percy, leaves England, leaves her father, and goes to Europe. And of course, this is when the infamous Via Diodati trip happens. She's inspired to write Frankenstein. But years later, they decide to leave again for various complex familial and political reasons that I won't go into. But essentially, they come back for a little bit, and then they go again. And in the 1820s, the Shelleys are in Italy. She's there with her stepsister, Claire Claremont. They're intermittently with other people like Byron. But while she's there, Shelley starts undertaking this intense historical research. She spends days going to various places in Tuscany, researching what would become a novel called Valperga. And in 1824, she publishes Valperga. I know I've asked you this before, but have you read Valperga?
I actually haven't. I feel like a bad gothicist. But,
no, it's fine. It's fine. Like,
basically,
it's a long book.
But yeah, basically, when I was doing my PhD, I was consumed with reading so many long books, some of which were not relevant, just to see if they were relevant or not. And then I finished my PhD, and I still haven't really got back into reading properly. Mm-hmm. It's almost like I'm so traumatized is the wrong word, but scarred that I've just needed a little bit of a break from books. Valperga is one of those ones that's on my list because it sounds really great. As you will now explain to us.
As I will now explain to you.
Yeah, and maybe the listener, like myself, can finally pick it up if you haven't already and read it and read it.
So I guess the question now is, why am I talking about Mary Shelley and not Walter Scott? Because you might think, okay, well, if we're going into the early 19th century, the natural author to talk about is Walter Scott, because he writes reams of novels, including Ivanhoe, about chivalry. And the reason is because Shelley does not fuck with chivalry. Shelley is like, this shit is absolute, it's just rubbish. It's not valuable. Is valuable. It's insufficient. It's a fallacy. Why the fuck are we still obsessed with this idea of chivalry? And you see it in Frankenstein and in her second novel, The Last Man, and you also see it in the short stories that she's writing in the lead up to 1824. She wrote a number of short stories for magazines like The Keepsake. If you haven't ever read any of her short stories, I highly recommend them. They're just really, really great examples of how good she was as a writer and how strong her imagination was and her perspective was. But Valperga is particularly important because it is set in the late 13th and early 14th century. It is called Valperga, but its subtitle is The Life of Castruccio, Prince of Lucca. And Castruccio was a real guy. He was the Prince of Lucca, and he was the leader of the Ghibelline faction, who in the 13th and 14th century had multiple wars with the Guelphs, and the Guelphs were mainly Tuscany, I believe. So, if you're not familiar with Italian history, it was lots of small kingdoms and principalities and duchies with big, strong warring families who would intermittently fight with one another, intermarry with one another, be allies, be enemies. And around this time, you have not only personal armies, so each great family, each principality, like the Medicis, for example, would have an army. But you also had essentially mercenary companies. And if you have read The Mysteries of Udolpho, you'd be familiar with this because they are the condottieri. And the condottieri are these soldiers for hire. And they problematize the idea of chivalry because there should be no such thing as a soldier for hire. You're meant to be a soldier for king and country. But Shelley very specifically picks this point in time because, as I mentioned in the last episode, you went to war in summer and you rested in winter. So Castruccio, she writes at the beginning of the novel, Castruccio is the most beautiful Gothic hero you've ever seen in your entire life. He's smart, he's noble, his poor parents get unfairly, his father's murdered and he wants to avenge him and his family and take back his power. And you're like, yes, this is the Gothic hero. Because as you know, Mary, most of the Gothic heroes and heroines are displaced in somehow. They're usually, their uncle's overthrown them and they've lost their rightful seat or something like that.
They're disinherited, or they're orphans that turn out to be heir to a massive fortune or a title or something like that. But yeah, that displacement is always there in some form or another.
Yeah. So that's kind of how we start with Castruccio. And at the beginning of the novel, he is this promising young heroic man. And he builds he's a wonderful, wonderful swordsman. He's an excellent military leader. He's a great statesman. And as the novel progresses, you realize that chivalry is not sustainable because violence is violence no matter what the cause. And Shelley basically fundamentally undermines and problematizes the idea of the chivalric hero. Now, it's worth noting that when the novel was finished and Percy Shelley wrote to advertise it to the publishers, he called Castruccio a little Napoleon. And there are definitely intentional allusions to Napoleon in this novel. The whole text is basically about two things. It's about how chivalry is just a complete load of bullshit. It's just a massive fallacy, a massive lie. It is something that we tell ourselves to make violence permissible, essentially. And what Shelley does is she presents this beautiful young man who is so full of potential, and she shows how he becomes corrupted by his military identity. He becomes power hungry, he becomes paranoid, he becomes desensitized. And she basically demonstrates that by engaging in violence and engaging in war, there is no way to maintain chivalry. You will always become the feudal tyrant because that's what happens when you commit violence, essentially. But she does something else as well. And what she also does is introduce two female heroines, Beatrice and Euthanasia. Beatrice is a priestess. She's a really fascinating character. Story for another time, maybe when we do some more on religious Gothic, because she basically gets kidnapped by some people and then decides that Christianity is a lie and everything is evil and God is evil. So fascinating. And Euthanasia is essentially a princess in the way that Castruccio is Prince of Lucca. Valperga is her castle. She is the mistress of Valperga. So the novel is named after Euthanasia's castle. These two women didn't exist. She writes them into the history. And this is what's really interesting because Shelley researched the fuck out of this novel. She did some amazing historical research. The details are brilliant, which you don't get in the Gothic. Gothic authors grasp of geography, not good.
Geography, the actual practicalities of religious orders. No, you would not have monks and nuns living together in the same house, and no, they would not be adjoined buildings. And yet.
So she writes these two women into the story. And they both have their lives destroyed by Castruccio and his obsession with his legacy, with his lineage, with his martial prowess, with his power. They are both consumed and destroyed by it. So they exist not only to show that chivalry is a load of bunk, but they also exist to recenter women's voices in wartime. And Shelley basically refuses the post-Napoleonic narrative of a righteous, virtuous British Empire. Britannia rules the waves, Britain the war hero. She's like, you can fuck off. I have seen the destruction and the devastation that this war caused. All war does is destroy. It destroys beauty, it destroys goodness, it destroys lands, and it consumes women. Euthanasia literally dies voiceless at the bottom of her boat is wrecked, she dies at the bottom of the sea, and then the novel ends. The novel doesn't end with Castruccio's death. Well, it kind of does, but the story, the narrative, as soon as Euthanasia is gone, the narrative is over. So Shelley essentially in 1824 is like, chivalry is not about women. You have been telling us for centuries that chivalry is about the defense of the innocent, the defense of women, the defense of beauty. But all war does is consume and destroy and corrupt all of those things. So how can chivalry do those things? And then essentially after that, we get this gap between the reality of war, the idea of chivalry, and to kind of skip forwards almost 2 centuries, that's how we end up with this idea that chivalry is opening the door for somebody. Like, chivalry is no longer really part of the stuff with war, but chivalry is still a fallacy even today, because you have all of these icky ideas of gender binary and gender roles and patriarchy wrapped up in it. And that's because it's never not been that. And
Gothic, because you should hold the door open for anyone. regardless of their gender and regardless of your gender, just because it's a nice, polite thing to do.
Yeah, and essentially what Shelley does is bring together what the Gothic writers had started to do during the 1790s and the early 1810s, 1800s and 1810s, which is go, this is full of shit, like, we're being lied to. You cannot be violent and be polite. You cannot be violent and be good. Those two things do not go together. Like, and they basically unpack and resist. And what they do is, in the same way that the Gothic was being used and continues to be used to reinforce the notion of chivalry as a brilliant nationalist, masculine ideal, it also resists against it. And basically that is what the Gothic has continued to do. Shelley in 1824 is just kind of putting the bow on it. She's like, as the kind of younger of this generation of writers that came through, like, this is my comment in on the post-Napoleonic. And then we just get this whole, I mean, fucking Frozen does it. Disney's Frozen does this. The guy in Frozen, Prince Hans, is like, you know, he seems so chivalric and polite. He's a fucking bad guy. So this all comes from the Gothic. The Gothic is used to reinstate and reinforce chivalry. And then it also gets used to unpack it. And that is the Gothic history of chivalry, my friend.
Well, thank you very much. I have learned a lot, and it's been really interesting. And I'm sure there's lots of people that will also agree with me. So yeah, thank you.
I hope so. Yeah. I'm sorry that there was less men on horses with sticks in this one. A lot of bayonets in the French Revolutionary Wars, although a lot of horses did die, and it was very sad. Which also,
but again,
don't say something about horses and then hurt all the horses.
Well, I was just going to say, like, if you do need your kind of horse fix, just go and watch A Knight's Tale. Yeah,
exactly. And in the words of Ken, patriarchy is way less interesting when it's not about horses.
Exactly.
I know I said that last time, but it stands to repeating. So yeah, that is why chivalry is so important in terms of the history of the Gothic. That's where so many of these Gothic tropes come from. And it's also where so many, particularly women and minority writers, have used the Gothic to push back against the falsehood that is chivalry. And I have to say, I'm on Mary Shelley's side. It's full of shit. So next time someone says to you, oh, chivalry's dead, say, good riddance, get in the ground. But yeah, that is that. We have some fun episodes coming up. We also have some guest stars. Some friends of the show are going to be coming on to tell us some fun stories about some fun Gothic things in the history of the world. We might be touching back again on the world of occultism. I've got a fun, funky Victorian going on to tell Mary about. And Mary's also going to tell us all about her trip to Prague. So stay tuned. We are back on a 2-week schedule. We also have more Lore Dump coming. If you haven't checked out the first episode of Lore Dump, this is a short form where we explain a key point in the Gothic history. So I did the first one on Gothic, and Mary has just recorded one that I will be editing shortly, all about vampires. And it's basically, you know, a primer, a TLDR about some of the important stuff on the Gothic. So if you want to let us know what you would like to have us talk about on the next meeting of the association, or if there's something you'd like us to cover in a Lore Dump, you can comment on the YouTube, you can respond to the Q&A, you can send us an email, you can comment on Insta or on Twitter. If you want to back us, you can also do so by donating to us on Ko-fi. Every little bit helps, but you don't have to. But if you would like to subscribe, and all of those things, then that does massively help us out and help us keep making content. I think that's everything I have to say on the matter, Mary.
I think you've covered everything excellently. So yeah, just get in touch if you want, in whatever way works for you. If you have any recommendations for things, or if you want to come on the show, then, get in touch. And then, until next time, I guess, stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky.